So, welcome back to the Raising Our Vibration podcast, where we explore higher consciousness through spiritual practice. And today, Dan McTiernan and I are going to talk about grounding, attunement, and release. So, I'm going to introduce Dan first. I often think what would happen if you combine the practicality of permaculture principles in conjunction with transpersonal psychology, energy meditation, nature, and that whole connection with our planet. Well, you would get Dan and also his dear wife Johanna, who are co-founders of Earthbound and live and manage a 6-acre homestead in Finland. So Dan is a certified transpersonal psychology coach and subtle energy meditation teacher. And he's been deeply involved in the permaculture movement as a teacher, entrepreneur, writer, and homesteader for 15 years. So Dan, it is an absolute pleasure to welcome you here. And I know we've got a lot to talk about as we go into the 3 pillars of this process of grounding, attunement, and release. So perhaps if I can get you to discuss first with us this wonderfully rich and deep subject, and perhaps what's happening right at the moment, in respect to this, in terms of your own research and exploration and experience, both what these elements of really look like individually, grounding, attunement, and release, but also what a truly integrated approach would look like when we include all 3 at a fundamental level. So I know this is a very rich and deep conversation, so I'm extremely excited both to welcome you and also to explore this with you.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me. I'm really happy to be having this conversation as well. And I guess the essence of it is something that's very dear to both our hearts, which is presence and what healing and growth modalities look like in and out of a grounded presence. And I've got lots of experience of this personally in my own kind of growth and healing experiences throughout my early adulthood and now into my middle adulthood. And I can also speak to this from a very client-centered point of view in terms of some of the experiences I've had with my transpersonal coaching clients and meditation students. And I think it's really interesting to begin to unpack what healing modalities look like at a relative level, i.e. a partial level, and at a fundamental level, so a completely holistic level. And I thought, these 3 principles or pillars or elements, whatever you want to call them, of grounding, attunement, and release seem like a useful framework to explore that. So for me, I've really been thinking about, what does a relative healing modality look like in each of those pillars? So we could take release to begin with and just look at a couple of examples. So one would be a purely transcendent spiritual practice. So one where we begin to let go of the notion that we're a physical body, that we're not our emotions, we're not our thoughts, we are pure spirit. And this is an upwards and outwards move. We transcend the dirty, messy, difficult daily life, and we bliss out basically in spirit. And of course, you and I have both had transcendent experiences, and it feels incredible. But there's a term for this in the meditation circles, which is spiritual bypass. And what happens is it becomes a form of dissociation. We move out of the body, we move out of material reality, and we just escape into no thingness, into these airy, blissful states. And that feels amazing when you're sat in deep meditation, and then you get up off the cushion and you go into your busy, messy, anxiety-inducing life, and you crash and burn. So it very quickly becomes an addictive cycle that, to get that hit, you have to spend more and more time meditating and less time off the cushion in daily life. And I would say that while there are aspects of that that are crucial to a fully realized healing process, that is a very partial approach to healing and growth. And then you could look at that from a kind of psychological point of view. So, for example, let's take cognitive behavioral therapy or some kind of talking therapy at that kind of level of cognition. Again, there's great relief to be found in identifying and to some extent reprogramming patterns of thought and behavior that don't serve us very well. And actually, that can bring about behavior change, and it can bring about an improvement in psychological well-being. But CBT is often referred to as a revolving door modality because it works for a while, and then it begins to not work so well. And then we find ourselves slowly coming back to some of the old sticky conditioning and programming patterns of behavior that maybe we had before. So those are both kind of forms of release that I would say were relative. And then you could bring that if we looked at attunement. And this is something that's been really interesting to me recently with clients, is that, as a culture, we're terrible at attuning to our felt direct experience. We talk a lot about interoception, and we practice interoception within subtle energy meditation. So it's, coming into direct experience of our inner life, our physical sensations, our emotions, our, the energy patterns of our thoughts, for example. And what's been interesting with clients recently is there's a lot of people practicing embodiment at the moment. It's a thing, isn't it? It's a movement that is really of the day. And that's great. We need to get back in touch. However, the experience I've had with several clients recently is that they've been trained to get in touch, and now they're engulfed by their inner experience. They're swamped. There's a tsunami of stuff swirling around inside them, and it's terrifying. They don't know what to do with it. And so, again, I would say embodiment of this type, so just learning to notice all the stuff that's inside you, is a very partial, relative way of doing that. And again, there is a benefit to that. We need to learn to tune into the kind of full bandwidth of our intelligence. But there's also a kind of cathartic move in that, isn't there? That when we come into direct relationship again with our, with all this stuff inside us, which we've been tamping down or avoiding for a very long period of time, there's clearly going to be an upwelling, an emotional upwelling, and that will burst out like, we'll cry, we'll scream, we'll shout, it's an emotional vomit up. And we know that after that process, after we've had a really good cry, you feel better for a while. But again, it's like just lifting the pressure valve up a little bit and letting that out. But we're, again, at a very relative level, we're just re-experiencing our trauma, our hurt, our emotional energy that's stuck within our body. There's no deep processing going on there. So this catharsis is just let some steam out because I have to. Otherwise, I'm going to go mad and be, swept away by these experiences. And then the final one would be something like, if we look at grounding. So I've gone kind of backwards in a way, although there's no linear approach, I would say, to grounding, attunement, and release. But again, grounding is one of those words, isn't it? That's like, I need to be more grounded. I need to, how do we ground? We talk about this. It's become a cultural currency. And an example of that would be something like 4-7-8 breath work. Okay, so that's where we take, a breath of 4 counts in, we hold that breath for 7 counts, and then we release it slowly for 8 counts. So essentially what we're doing is doubling the time, the length of out breath to in breath. And what that does physiologically is stimulate our parasympathetic nervous system, which will downregulate our nervous system into a calmer state, a state in which we can begin to relax and begin to rest, digest, as it's often called. And that's great. Again, I'm not dismissing any of these modalities, but if you treat that as a tool to alleviate anxiety, that's what it is. Again, it's another pressure release. We downregulate for a while until we upregulate and we're out of regulation, and then we let the steam out again. And we just cycle through that. So again, it's another, if you want to call it a revolving door or whatever, we keep coming back to it. And all of these are just symptom relief. We're not actually ever addressing anything fundamental. And what I'm interested in doing, and what I think you're interested in doing, is exploring how do we get off this treadmill of self-improvement, of perpetually healing, of seeking, and how do we really transform in a way that completely shifts the way we experience ourselves in relation to other people, to the world, so that we are healed, we are whole at a fundamental level. And I think the answer to that is we have to bring presence into the mix. Without that, these are tools that are being used in the opposite of presence, absence. So I don't know what you think about that.
So it's so true. Oh, I'm with you all the way, 100%. I know that you've been going through various retreats and programs with John Prendergast, the author of The Deep Heart. And I know, John's whole, the ethos is around a portal to presence. It's really singing that melody, which actually we're talking about, which I fundamentally work with clients on too. So I'm just interested if you could perhaps share with us some of the experiences you've had either with John or on the retreats or on the programs, because I think that does speak straight to the heart of this, the deep transformation, because you're right, otherwise it does come down to symptom relief. You can have a transcendent experience with it, which is this upward movement, and you can feel for a while that you're very truly in bliss. But in fact, what you've done is you've reached a blissful state. And when that blissful state is not easily meeting the marketplace of our day-to-day life, then you can just want to retreat into the bliss state. And that might be just the only way that you experience that is through isolation in some form or another. So in that sense, it's been very hard to meet community with presence, if you want to look at it in a deeper way, with presence of whatever that is. And it's not a state. This is something Kevin and I often speak about, is presence is actually a way of being. I mean, it is a presence itself is something that Rumi and many other of the great beings that have walked our planet, like many of you that are listening, where the beauty of presence itself is that which dances in your inner being. It's that when you're actually resting in that space or that awareness of what's within, and the beauty of the dance of what's within, you rest back as that presence, and then everything else is embraced within that. So everything that arises becomes a dance of that, or a dance with that presence, and a dance from presence. In other words, you're actually resting in presence, and everything arises within that. So I'd be really curious about you speaking to that, about your experiences with the portal of presence and John, and also with the programs, particularly in relation to what you're speaking about, that transcendence and embodiment and all the healing and seeking, they do provide tools, and they're frameworks in some way, but without a real integral understanding, you're going to simply start to objectify states, you'll objectify processes, you won't necessarily have any sense of presence with any one of those. You will actually just be seeking to have a state continuously that you go to in times of need, and you haven't yet found a way to integrate it. So I'm really curious about you sharing anything to do with that.
Yeah. Well, I think you're absolutely right about that chasing of states. And I think that's what it essentially boils down to, is that it's very akin to an addiction, isn't it? Because you're seeking, you want to feel better. You know, you don't want to feel lost. You don't want to feel scared. You don't want to feel that life's hard. And so obviously you chase a modality and it works for a while, and then it starts to fade a little bit. So you seek your next hit. And then, you know, we all know, and I've been one of them, you know, people that are kind of junkies for that, looking for the answer. And my experience with psycho-spiritual work has been very much a story of that. From, you know, I was taught to meditate, transcendental meditation, really early when I was 5. And I've always had a very strong calling to, you know, what I would probably now call self or something, a calling home. So I've always felt this pull, and I have not very skillfully followed that calling for a lot of my younger years. So I would use meditation as crisis management, you know, kind of rescue remedy in the moment when nothing else was working. Or I'd use alcohol, you know, and they were both kind of interchangeable. Or I'd use avoidance, and I'd, you know, entertainment, whatever. And I've done talking therapy work. I've had, you know, I've taken antidepressants in the past, and, you know, I've been through the gamut of seeking help, seeking relief, self-improvement, self-transcendence in a way. And that all came really to a head about, I'd say, about 6 years ago now, when I had a major crash, basically. I've had multiple kind of burnout stroke states of depression in my early adulthood, but this was a complete body shutdown, basically. A very severe state of fatigue and weakness and brain fog, and I'm sure lots of people listening to this will have had some kind of experience of that. And went through the classic, you know, I couldn't lift a cup of tea to my lips, you know, walking to the post box I'd be drenched in sweat and shaking, and I had a constant internal tremor. And I went to the doctor thinking I was dying of something, and they did all the tests, and there's nothing wrong with you, sir. Physiologically, you're fine, you know. And that was really for me, the kind of final wake-up call, in that sense, that I knew that that was true, that there wasn't anything kind of medically obviously wrong with me, but there was something deeply wrong. And that was that I was completely out of touch with myself, with my body, with presence, with myself as a being. I was completely stuck in thinking and doing, and I knew that I had to shift. And the way into that for me was a process of embodiment. But very fortunately for me, I came across this presence-based way of approaching reconnection, and eventually came to you and Kevin, and learned subtle energy meditation with you, and trained with you to become a teacher, and along that path discovered really for the first time that what we've forgotten culturally, that we are fundamentally beings, and we behave as if we're just cognition machines of action and thinking. And that was completely novel to me, really. I touched into that in meditation, but it had always been, like you say, a peak state. I'd had moments when the ground opened, or I felt an experience of vastness and silence and stillness. But it was always in formal meditation, and then that would be a passing state, and I'd come back to my small, contracted, crazy little self. And so for me, that was, well, it's changed my life basically. And what that is the process of, is letting go of the notion that you can think your way into wholeness. It's impossible, basically. Our prefrontal cortex is designed to partition the world into problems that need solving, basically, small parts. And our culture follows that same pattern. So it was letting go of that thinking dominance and coming into feeling, but coming into feeling in presence. And what do we mean by presence? So the first thing to say is you can't think your way into wholeness. You can't think your way into presence. So you have to start feeling your way into presence. And what does that feel like? Well, for me, it's been not an upwards and outwards movement to begin with. It's been very much an inwards and downwards movement. So it's a coming to rest in my body, in my, my pelvis, for example, and noticing that there's an aspect of self that feels safe. And that, again, feels like a peak state to begin with. You start to tune into it. And even though at this relative level, your mind can be all over the place, you can feel anxiety in your, in your chest and your solar plexus. But there's an aspect of self that is beyond that, that feels stable, that feels grounded. And through repetition, you begin to trust that this isn't a peak state, actually. This is, as you've just said, this is our natural state. This is what I would call natural being. And when you start to tune into that, you notice that not only does that feel trustworthy, so like any relationship, repetition, consistent turning up, consistent behavior over time brings about trust. So you begin to trust in that this isn't just this passing, fleeting good feeling. This is something really stable. And then through that, you begin to notice that the edges of that are not confined within the boundary of your skin. And, you do a lot of work around, experiencing self as energy, self as space, and then realizing that actually that energy and that space are not limited, not bounded in any way, shape, or form eventually, as you begin to let go into that. So there's a kind of trusting and a merging into something much bigger. And then from there, this attunement move starts to become much more a much safer experience, a richer and a safer experience. So to begin with, when you're attuning, everything feels new and weird, and okay, I can feel that. That's strange. And then this strong emotion comes and washes over, and you're like, oh, okay, can I cope with that? The container of yourself feels quite small. As you trust and open into the ground, into groundedness, then the container of you becomes vaster. And that's been, for me, the real kind of key to this fundamental transformation. You then are able to lean into all that difficult stuff that's been bound up in the fascia of your body, the held childhood hurt, trauma, intergenerational trauma, because there's a safe, vast container for that. And I really like that teacup metaphor example. If you've got a small coffee cup and you've got a lot of salt in the water, which is basically the coffee cup represents our small contained conditioned self, or the perception of ourself as that, the salt, a spoon of salt in that water is overwhelming. It's horrible. It's poison, actually. And that's what it feels like to be with these deep, old traumas. But when you open up into the vastness of a lake, you know, the equivalent, the metaphorical lake of being, then you can be with that saltiness, and it's not toxic anymore. You can come to your experience directly with compassion, without judgment, with openness. And that's when stuff starts to shift. So that's when real release happens. And for me, combining that very embodied meditation process of learning to ground, learning to attune, with a strong psychological element to it, so that we are approaching our full self. You know, it's not a case for me of I'm not my thoughts, I'm not my emotions, I'm not my body. It's I have emotions, but I'm more than my emotions. I have thoughts, but I'm more than that. I have a body, it's beautiful, but the boundary of me is more than that. Then release happens. And then you start to create this kind of spiral of those three elements really working together. So when you start to release, there's more space. And then you can ground a little bit deeper. And then from even more sense of safety, you can attune and you start to experience life more richly. And that allows you to release, and so on and so forth. So combination of it, kind of with you two as teachers, for example, you and Kevin really opened that interoceptive, compassionate, mindful approach to meditation and to experience. And then, you know, a lot of your work does touch on the psychological, but for me, with John Prendergast has been very catalytic in that he's actually a non-dual depth psychologist and spiritual teacher. So he's definitely coming at it from a psychological point of view. And his main message, I would say, is fundamental enoughness, okayness. You know, there's no the end of the self-development project, the end of seeking, and recognizing on ever more fundamental levels that you are enough, you are whole, and as such, you are part of everything else. And so that's been, well, remarkable, really, I would say, for me.
It's beautiful, beautiful what you're sharing. You know, as you're talking about that, you remind them, and it may spark some certain similarities. So I'd be curious in sharing about this. That, like you, I see a lot of clients in any 1 week, and the kind of process that I felt was very useful in terms of embodying presence. So this might just spark something, or we could share something about the way that we actually do this, because I'm sure for those of you that are listening, if you haven't experienced what Dan's speaking about, sometimes you think, well, okay, yeah, well, great, this is very exciting. How do I do this? So I'll give you some examples of kind of what I've found, and I'll give you a direct example. So a classic thing that happens to me, without kind of going too much into details of individual people, is that somebody in positions of what I would call head authority, you know, that they're really strong conceptual thinkers. They'll come to visit me for a cup of tea, as I put it, and they're very much in the head and in the concept. So they might be a CEO of a company, and they might be running quite a number of companies. So I see a lot of CEOs of large organizations, and so these are people with a lot of authority, both men and women, who have a lot of conceptual issues to deal with, and they tend to approach all of their solutions from, well, okay, how am I going to think it through? How am I going to divide this up? Where do I put my energies? How do I? And they're often quite confused about how to actually solve multiple problems. So the very first thing that I do is I direct them from their head and their concepts into their heart, because very much like the practices you're talking about, when we actually bring awareness deep down into our heart, there's a sense of just simply being able to rest and be that presence. in our deeper heart, and if you want to put it that way. And a good example would be, so I quite often ask people, where have they felt most safe, safety and trust? Where did they really, in a childhood time, teenage years, adulthood, where have they really learned to trust? So a beautiful example that particularly struck me was this wonderful head of a number of organizations who said, oh, it was a time when I was back when a child, and I just used to paddle in a creek. And I said, so what does that feel like? Now, so as soon as, if you're listening and you can remember a time in childhood when you actually could go back to that really deep heart, that time of just, it's very simple, right? It's very knowing, simplicity, just simply being. And that's what he said. He said, oh, I haven't remembered this, but it was a time when I was, 8 years old, and I was paddling in the creek, and it's just by myself, and I used to paddle and put my feet in the creek, and I felt so good. I said, so where did you feel it? I said, well, it's like right down in my gut. It's right there. It's not only in my heart, because there's this feeling of safety, but there's also this gut knowing. So there's that knowing and feeling that happens. So I said, can you rest in that? Can you rest back in that knowing, feeling, safety, and being, this presence, right, of just feeling just like you did back then when you used to paddle in the creek? And he said, oh yeah. I said, how do you feel? He said, it feels so good. I feel so peaceful. So kind of at home, this home that he actually said to me, oh, I haven't thought of this for 40 years. And that's often what happens, right? We've been so much in our head that we've forgotten about the matters of the heart and how to actually touch the heart. So I'd just get him to rest back in this incredible opportunity to be in this beautiful presence of the heart. And so from that heart, I then get him to really go into a state of inquiry of but from the heart, not from the head. I said, what if you were to, so we took his, half a dozen organizations, which were quite large ones, $1 million corporations. And we looked at, I said, what's the biggest problem here? And, and when he said, oh, it's, this partnership, or it's this deal, or it's this, and he said, I said, what do you usually do? Oh, he said, I just really, it makes me so annoyed. I said, what about if you just rest back in presence? If you were to solve all your problems from this creek or this river or this little 8-year-old who's paddling in the, what if you to just rest in that simple, it's a portal to presence, right? Actually, that's what that creek is, because he can feel it. There's a felt sensation. It's very deep in the body. So this beautiful soul is feeling this presence. He said, and it, it was so beautiful because he said, I know exactly what I've got to do. He said, all I need to do is, he said, I've handed away all my, heart through to these people to run my organization. And I said, I've trusted them and they've screwed it up. But he said, actually, when I'm resting here like this, paddling in the creek, he said, I can actually feel. All I need to do is, he said, I'm going to go in there on Monday. And he said, they won't expect it, but I'm actually going to go and sit in that meeting and actually lead from the heart. I'm going to ask them, because these wrangling problems have gone on for several years. And he said, I've just kind of, I've put it out of sight, out of my, I don't want to deal with it. But he said, I can see that if I go in there for 30 minutes, and just simply rest in my heart like this. I said, that's the key, right? Is presence. If you can simply be present to this open-hearted experience of life, instead of trying to solve everything from the head. So there's a sense of, so what we did was, we did simply a system of inquiry. We looked through every single one of his problems, and we looked at them all from this vast open potential. That in fact, there were limitless opportunities, and he'd never considered solving them from this simple presence of heart. And in fact, as he proved to himself, and I think this is the wonderful thing, if you're listening and you're resting back in your heart and you're looking at your life or struggles or problems, you suddenly realize that, oh, I've been actually looking at my problems as very specific problems that are almost as set, like he was doing, like as separate from ourselves. Instead of seeing that the problems are like oceans and waves, then in fact they're all part of the ocean. And when you're resting back as this open, deep heart, which can embrace all things, then in fact you do come up practically with different solutions. Because you start to actually see the solutions as the water, as this presence. You start to actually recognize that you could go into even a meeting and actually share with presence. So you're no longer seeing the object. You're no longer saying, oh, that problem is actually a wave and it's not connected to the ocean. You're seeing it as somewhere and it's got ruffled up and it's got winds plummeting it, and you've forgotten that it's water. You've forgotten that it's that same water of presence that you're in now. So he actually discovered an entirely different, through this inquiry and through seeing that, in fact, he wasn't separate from the problems, that actually they're actually water and they're actually part of the ocean as well. So what I got him to do was to do very simple practices to bring up an ordinary everyday kind of eating your breakfast and see that that's water. There's water in that, right? That's your thought of you're simply present. You can do it right now as you're listening to me. You can be present with your breakfast. And most people find that really easy and they go, oh yeah, I get you. I'm just simply present. You're sitting back in your deep heart, opening to your breakfast, your peanut butter and jelly sandwich, whatever it is you have for that. I always use it because it makes people chuckle. And then I say, great, if you can do that, can you also bring up a positive experience and rest back as this open heart that embraces your positive experience? And he said, yeah. Oh yeah, I got this friend I really love and I love to be with her. So yeah, I can feel it. So I said, what about if you now, it's all water, right? That's all the ocean, because it's still the ocean. And then what about if you bring up that really sticky company problem and still rest back in the same way as you do with your breakfast and your beautiful friend? And he said, I've never seen it like that, right? We tend not to, it's a little bit like the discussion we were talking about with states. We tend to objectify them. We say, oh, okay, I can rest in my heart when I'm in love with somebody, but I can't rest in my heart when I'm dealing with this really torrid struggle between this partnership of these two companies that I've set up. No, well, in fact, that was one of the beautiful ahas that he had, is that you can just simply, and then you start to see something happens. You start to, you step back from experience, and then actually curiously enough, you go back into it and you embrace it and you move through, and with your experience, you're suddenly you're reintegrating it, which was what you were sharing, that beautiful essence. And then a whole lot of things come up. You start to really look at, oh, actually, and maybe one of my beliefs I've had is that I'm this, which is very partial. I'm all these ideas and beliefs and pasts and futures. And that's what you suddenly have an aha of, well, I'm much, just as you so beautifully said, I'm much, much more than that. In fact, those limiting beliefs are actually what's set up all these ways of you dealing with your half a dozen organizations and you've actually set it up. You start to realize, oh, they're actually my ocean too. They're the water. I've actually set the whole thing up like that. Like, he kind of saw the whole picture. He was actually able, in just a 90-minute period, to start to see the ocean and the waves, to start to recognize that he could really deeply inquire into his core beliefs and actually live from his heart, and that he could awaken this really powerful, deep-hearted experience and shine. And he went to this, and he went to the meeting, and he rang me up afterwards, and he said, it was just so beautiful. And he said, I went in that meeting, and he said, for the first time, in years, he said, I actually did exactly what you said. I went in the meeting, and before I did anything, I just said to everybody, right, we're going to pause for a minute or so. And he said, I actually did what you did. He said, I want you to remember time in your childhood when you felt really safe and really good and really trusting of each other, of, this heart, this deep heart, when you really were in that deep part of experience. And he said, I'm going to do it too. And he described to them, paddling in the creek, because he gave them his example. So he sat and he did that. And then he said, now we're going to solve all our problems from this really deep, open heart, this very deep, open, compassionate heart. And he said it was amazing. Now they actually solved a problem they've been arguing about for 2 years. And so I actually love that example. He was a very wise being. And he rang me up afterwards and he said, Stephen, somehow, he said, you're teaching me to be an open-hearted leader. He said, I finally realized it after I went through these last few days. He said, I've been so stressed for two entire years. And now I feel like I haven't got them anymore. He said, I can't find those stresses. So anyway, I wanted to relate that in detail because just so that you're working with clients, I'm working with clients, John is, Kevin is, we all are. So I'm curious about some of the way, whether that sits, with you and how you work and
yeah, I mean, that sounds so resonant with experiences I've had with clients as well. And I think, what came up for me in that was, that you touched into that within 90 minutes. So this isn't a million miles away. And I think a lot of people get frightened about the idea of, self-transcendence, enlightenment. It's this never-ending path that we have to. But actually, if we come back to the notion that presence is just our natural state of being, that's all it is. And all we're doing actually is tuning into that. We're just remembering and then noticing, and then again the phrase you used, resting back into. And that's all we're doing. It's super simple. There's no secret. Obviously it's a practice and we have to continually remember and attune and rest back because we forget. But it's not this, mountain peak many lifetimes away. It's right here, right now. It's just who we are on a fundamental level. So I think that's very beautiful. And I've had that experience lots of times with clients that, a quick example would be a woman that I was working with who had a very busy life, lots of kids, very busy community commitments, running her own small business, but was also a painter and desperately wanted to do more painting. So it was her pastime. It wasn't an occupation. It wasn't for money. And she'd hired a studio to do that, and it cost, obviously studios cost money, but she felt like she didn't have enough time to be in that studio, and she felt pressure from her husband and her family to give up on the studio. But there was something in her, a calling that she identified with as being an artist. And I asked her, much the same way that you did with the guy that found where in his body that creek safety was. I asked her to tune into where she was an artist. Where are you an artist? And she felt that deep in the back of her pelvis, somewhere towards the base of her spine. And you just saw her body shift, her shoulders relax. And she said, it's just perfectly still there. And it feels so strongly like me. And I think she may have used the phrase home as well. And I think, that was a very quick inquiry process through, we meditated together for a while and then we just asked some questions in a meditative state, and we tuned in more and more and rested back more and more into presence. And it's definitely a co-regulatory process. So the coach is as important in that process because you're holding that space for, and the more grounded in presence, the more open and available you are, the more, as a fellow mammalian being, your client will be able to do the same. And that's obviously what your client was doing for his employees in that moment. And so from that place where she just found home base, basically, she found what it felt like to just rest deeply in presence. And it had that flavor of artist for her, or she gave it the label artist, but it was just her deep self. And so from there, I asked her to explore over the coming couple of weeks until we met again, where else that showed up, where else in her life, when she tuned back into that, what other aspects of her life felt like that artist. And she brought that into a very busy catering job she had, when normally she's totally head-oriented, control freak, she called herself, like micromanaging, stressed completely. And she said I just kind of opened, and she hosted another, and so she trusted as well. So she let go of control a lot, and she trusted that the people working with her were getting on with stuff just fine, and life was flowing. And then she hosted another event later in the week, and she said she'd never felt more comfortable in her own skin hosting an event. And that was, again, 90-minute session. And I'm not advocating that this is a 90-minute quick fix, because this is the opposite of that. This is a lifelong practice. But what I am suggesting is that touching into deep presence and experiencing the fullness of yourself is right here, right now, just moments away, and is easy. And I think a really good, to offer another kind of quick practice that people can do. And I've taken this from a transpersonal coach called Nicholas Yanni, and he works again with high-level CEOs, and he works in big, evil corporations like mining corporations and petrochemical organizations and stuff like that, but with leaders that are open to transformation and want to experience, want to deepen into their true selves. And he talks about the forwards and the backwards circle. And so it's a moment by moment presencing process. So if you think about, there are basically two moves with our consciousness. The normal move, which most people spend most of their time in, is this upwards and outwards move. So our shoulders come up, we come into our heads, we actually project beyond our heads into this kind of amorphous cloud of confused thoughts and emotions, and we're scanning constantly upwards and outwards. So there's an inbuilt vigilance there, that we think that if we can project our consciousness, a meter or two beyond us, then we've got that kind of force field that we can repel any dangers, and we can scout ahead. Excuse me. And we all know what that feels like when we're lost in that moment, when we're up and out. And that's absence. We're not in presence. We're not in our bodies. We're not awake. We're lost in that cloud of thought and action. And we can feel the tension of that in our bodies. And so the simple presencing process is just to reverse the circle. So that's a forward circle. So we just step off that treadmill, and we step on the backward circle. And that's just the opposite. So we might notice that, I hold a lot of tension in my eyes. I tense my eyes when I'm lost in thought, and my forehead. So you relax that consciously. So we do some bodily relaxation. We let our shoulders drop. But then we also do something else with our consciousness. So we, with each out breath, we just come further down the circle to the back of our body, somewhere into the core of our body, to the trunk. And with each breath, just follow the circle down, and again, into the heart, into the gut, into the pelvis, wherever, feels like home base for you. And I found actually with most clients, the further down we can go, and I know you're very heart focused in your work, and I am too. I will do a lot of inquiry work in the heart, but I feel that people are so far up here that we kind of need to go really far down to begin with. Come as far down as possible into the body, and then we can come back to the heart, because it's too near the head otherwise sometimes for people, and they get lost again very quickly. So yeah, deep backwards circle, deep into the pelvic bowl, and that's physiological, it's psychological, and it's again touching into presence. And then from there you can be both open, so you notice there is space above that. There is space in your chest to have experience. There's space in your head. It's a wonderful experience, isn't it, to be in your head and experience stillness, silence, and spaciousness, when normally we associate it with just this tangled knot of craziness. And yeah, so when you're fully in that kind of embodied presence, you feel open, but then you feel available. So it's this open availability, so that then when you open that kind of neuroceptive field, as it's called, so it's a psycho-spiritual emotional resonance field between two people or between you and the world, then that's when new things happen. And he's big on that in terms of, you just said that those problems that were 2 years old got solved in a meeting or two after that, because it was everyone came into presence. Well, Nicholas Yanni would say that the novelty only comes from presence. That is a creative upwelling from presence. Otherwise, you just repeat the same stories that you've been repeating forever, because you're stuck in the tape loop of conditioning. But when you're fully present, I'm open, I'm available, and I have no idea what's going to happen next. And I'm okay with that, because I feel safe and I feel comfortable sharing that with you. Then new amazing things arise.
Beautiful. That seems a very beautiful point in which to bring this to a close, because I was very present as you were sharing and coming down into presence, because I can see energy fields. I've always been able to see people's energy fields since I was a little fellow. And as you came down and down, your whole field shifted. It was really quite beautiful, like watching an angel. So I saw your angelic true self, and it's like I saw your future self, and it was just magnificent. I thought, oh wow, Dan's going to be doing this all over the planet. So Dan, I just wanted to, with incredible love and blessings for the work that you do. Yeah, I really, really was very touched, and I'm sure everybody listening will be deeply touched by this. So thank you. It was most beautiful. So if you're listening or watching, I'd like to thank you for your practice. So Earthbound, that's the project that Dan and Johanna run, actually offers one-to-one and group coaching, facilitating growth and connection and healing at that fertile edge between transpersonal psychology, embodied meditation, and permaculture. So if you're wanting to contact Dan and Johanna, you can obviously contact them through raisingourvibration.net, but I'm also going to put the link. So you'll find the link both in the podcast and also in the YouTube. And Dan, maybe you could give some reference points to people just before I finish off about where and how they can find you and Johanna.
Yeah, well, thank you very much for that. Yeah, the best place is our website, earthbound.fi for Finland. And like I said, we offer one-to-one coaching and also meditation courses, and there's lots of other resources there as well. So yeah,
wonderful. And I thoroughly recommend on every level getting in touch with Dan and Johanna, because they are truly precious beings. So you'll find them just like this podcast, that they're full of heart and full of love and full of this incredibly dynamic potential for you, that they really embrace everything you are and bring that home for you. So thank you all very much for watching and for listening, and thank you for your practice and for engaging with Dan and I here. And if you'd like to learn more about these practices of meditation, awareness, subtle energy, then please look at our ROV meditation app and our Raising Our Vibration community of practice. So we'd love to have you visit us at any time at raisingourvibration.net. So until next time, enjoy your practice. Love and blessings from us both. And please rest in presence.